"Sir, can you hear me?" Her palm pressed flat against his chest, and his heart wasn't beating right. A stutter, fighting hard to hold rhythm, and losing fast under her hand. His eyes locked onto hers, desperate, refusing to let go, his mouth working helplessly around air that would not come. She had no phone left, no minutes left, nothing but her own raw scream tearing through her throat, while his fingers clamped hard around her wrist, cold, weakening by the second. "You're not alone out here. I got you." His lips moved with what strength he had left. "Tell Judith." The sentence broke apart before he could finish it, his grip tightening one final time around her wrist. "Subscribe right now. Tell me where you're listening from, because what happens in the next 60 seconds decides whether this billionaire lives long enough to say her own name. "Please don't leave me, sir." Her knees hit the gravel before her mind caught up to what her body already knew. The man in front of her was dying. She pressed her palm flat against his chest and felt his heart doing something it wasn't supposed to do, a stutter instead of a beat, fighting to hold rhythm and losing. His suit was gray, tailored, soaked dark at the shoulder from a rain that hadn't started yet, but had already left the air thick enough to taste. He'd fallen against the base of the ice machine behind the marathon station on Route 41, folded at an angle no one chooses on purpose. She knew every inch of this lot in the dark. She slept 40 feet from where he was dying, behind the propane cage where the security light never reached, and she had never once seen a stranger back here who looked like he belonged somewhere else entirely. His eyes found her, and held, desperate, unwilling to let go. "Sir, can you hear me?" She tapped his cheek, careful, urgent. "Don't close your eyes. Stay with me." He tried to answer. Nothing came but breath, and not enough of it. She had 11% battery, and no minutes left on the burner in her coat pocket, so she didn't waste time on a phone that would die mid-call. She screamed for the clerk instead, screamed until her throat tore, and a heavy-set man in a marathon polo came running out from behind the register with his own phone already dialing. "He's not breathing right," she said, still on her knees, still pressing down. "His heart's doing something wrong. Hurry." The clerk's voice cracked out the address to a dispatcher while she kept her hand where it was, because some part of her believed that letting go was the same as letting him die. The man's fingers found her wrist, weak, cold. His grip tightened around her instead of loosening. "You're not alone out here," she said, quieter now, just for him. "I got you. I'm not going anywhere." Something in his face eased for half a second, then his grip tightened again, and his lips moved with what strength he had left. "Tell Judith." His voice broke apart before the sentence could finish. The account never closed. She had no idea what that meant. She filed it away anyway, the same instinct that had kept her alive out here for years, because information was the only currency nobody could steal off you while you slept. Subscribe now, because this stranger's kindness is about to cost her everything. Sirens cut through the dark before she finished the thought. Red and blue light swept the gravel, turning the propane cage and the dumpsters, and the man's expensive ruined suit, all the same flat color. 2 paramedics hit the ground running, one calling vitals to the other in short clipped numbers Odessa didn't understand but recognized as bad. A blood pressure cuff went on. A monitor started beeping too fast, then faster, and one of the paramedics swore under his breath and reached for something in the bag without looking away from the man's face. "Stay with us," the paramedic said, low, urgent, the same words Odessa had used a minute earlier, without either of them knowing it. "Ma'am, we need you to step back." "Her name's Odessa," the clerk called out, jogging up behind them. "She's the one who found him. She's the one who's been doing all this." She stepped back. Her hand felt strange and empty without his chest under it. They lifted him onto the gurney fast, practiced, and one paramedic's fingers brushed the wallet in his jacket as they moved him. He went still for half a second, staring down at whatever he'd seen inside it, the stillness of a man who just recognized exactly how much danger he was standing next to. He didn't say the name out loud. Not yet. He just looked back once at Odessa, differently than he had a moment ago, before he climbed into the ambulance behind the stretcher. The doors shut. The siren rose. Odessa stood alone in the gravel lot, with her hand still curled from where she'd pressed it against a stranger's heart, watching red light shrink down Route 41 until the dark closed over it completely. The clerk stood beside her for a moment, silent, then went back inside without a word, leaving her with nothing but gravel dust on her knees and a sentence she didn't understand. She didn't know if she was allowed to follow. Nobody had ever taught her the rules for a night like this one, and the rain that had been threatening all evening finally started to fall, cold and thin, running down the back of her neck as the sirens faded into nothing. Coliseum Health smelled like bleach and old coffee, and Odessa sat in a plastic chair near the vending machines because a nurse had told her to wait for someone to take her statement. Nobody came. She watched the automatic doors slide open and shut on strangers, who all seemed to know exactly where they belonged, and she pulled her donated coat tighter, aware suddenly of the gravel dust still ground into her jeans. A paramedic passed close enough for her to hear him say it to another nurse, low, uncertain, still deciding whether to believe it himself. "You know who that was? Roland Strand, founder of Strand Logistics." His voice dropped even lower on the name, careful, almost reverent. Odessa turned the words over. She'd unloaded pallets off Strand trucks for cash more than once, off the books, behind 3 different stores. Green and silver, always moving, always somebody else's problem to notice. She had never once looked at a driver's face. She hadn't known the man dying in the gravel owned all of it. A set of automatic doors opened differently than the others had, faster, sharper. A man came through them first, silver at the temples, suit pressed even at this hour, his stride already claiming the hallway, before anyone told him it was his. He didn't ask anyone where Roland Strand was, he already knew. He stopped in front of Odessa without introducing himself. "You're the one who called it in?" "I found him," she said. "I stayed with him till the ambulance came." His eyes moved over her, the coat, the scraped knuckles, the dust on her jeans, cataloging each detail, already building a case against her. "And you were back there because—" "I sleep back there sometimes." Something in his face didn't change so much as settle, confirming whatever he'd already decided before she answered. He turned to the nurse instead of her, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "Has security confirmed what she was carrying near Mr. Strand? Before we assume this was as simple as it sounds." The nurse hesitated. "She's the one who called it in, Mr. Pruitt." "I understand that." Foster Pruitt's tone stayed even, reasonable. A man simply protecting his employer's interests. "I just think it's worth being careful. You understand how these things can look." Odessa said nothing. There was nothing to say to a question built to sound harmless, while it took something from her anyway. She'd learned that particular silence years ago, the one that comes after being accused of something in language soft enough that objecting makes you look guiltier. "We'll take it from here," Pruitt told the nurse. "She's free to go. Her presence isn't required." He said it polite and final, a decision already made and closed, already moving on to the next problem on his list. "I'd like to know if he's okay," Odessa said. Pruitt didn't answer that. He was already walking away, already speaking to someone else on his phone, in a voice that had shed all its careful softness the moment he stopped needing it. The nurse glanced at Odessa with something close to apology, but apology didn't change the outcome. A security guard appeared at the end of the hallway, not touching her, just standing there in the specific way that meant leave now without anyone having to say it out loud. Odessa stood. Her legs still ached from the quarter-mile she'd run behind the ambulance before they'd given out. Nobody offered her a ride, a number to call, or a single word about whether the man she'd knelt over in the gravel was alive on the other side of those doors. She walked out into a night that had finally started raining, past a parking lot full of cars that cost more than she'd see in her lifetime, and understood, plainly, without needing anyone to tell her twice, that being the one who helped had never once meant being believed. Behind her, 3 floors up, a monitor had started beeping steady again. She had no way of knowing that. All she knew was the rain, and the long walk back to a gravel lot that no longer felt like the safest place she had. Her shoes soaking through with every step, the hospital lights shrinking smaller behind her, until even those disappeared. Roland Strand surfaced slowly, his lungs pulling air back into rhythm, before his mind caught up to the rest of him. The ceiling tile above him was the first thing he understood. A water stain in the corner shaped like nothing in particular. Machines clicked and hummed somewhere near his shoulder. Unfamiliar, patient. The second thing he understood was pain, dull and total, radiating from somewhere behind his sternum. The third thing, before his own name, before the tubes in his arm, before he remembered he had a company or a driver, or a scheduled Tuesday morning, was a voice. A girl's voice. "Please don't leave me, sir." He tried to speak and produced only a dry click in his throat. A nurse leaned over him, adjusting something above his head. "Mr. Strand, you're at Coliseum Health. You're safe." "The girl," he managed. "Where's the girl?" The nurse hesitated in a way that told him something before she said a word. "I'm sorry?" "She was with me. In the lot. She held on to me." His voice cracked on the last word, and he hated that it did. Hated needing anything this badly in front of a stranger. "Find her." It was Foster Pruitt who answered instead, stepping into the doorway with the practiced calm of a man delivering news he'd already decided how to shape. His tie knotted as precisely as it had been at midnight when the call first came in. "There was a young woman, yes. I handled it personally. She'd already left by the time things settled down." Roland turned his head, slow, careful, and looked at him for a long moment. "You handled it." "I made sure hospital security had her information on file." "Standard procedure." "Then find her again," Roland said. "Today." Pruitt didn't move right away, and something in that half-second hesitation lodged itself in Roland's memory. Small, easy to miss, impossible to fully shake loose. "Of course. I'll have someone locate her." "Not someone, you." "Roland, she's homeless. These situations can get complicated fast if the wrong person decides there's money in it. I only thought it best to handle things cleanly before anyone got the wrong idea." Pruitt's tone stayed even, reasonable, the same tone he'd used on every board member Roland had ever watched him quietly outmaneuver. A tone built to sound like protection while it took something from the room instead. Roland studied him. 22 years Foster Pruitt had sat 2 seats down from him in every boardroom that mattered, and not once in 22 years had Roland heard him make a decision that wasn't already calculated 3 moves ahead. That should have meant loyalty. Lying here with a tube in his arm, watching Pruitt's face stay perfectly composed under a question that should have unsettled anyone, Roland felt something else entirely, though he couldn't yet put a name to what. "Today, not tomorrow." Roland's voice hardened. "I don't care what it costs or who you have to wake up to do it." This isn't the last lie he'll tell. Subscribe to see it unravel. A different knock interrupted before Pruitt could answer. His cardiologist, a slight woman named Priya Anand, stepping in with a tablet held tight against her chest, reluctant, her eyes flicking once toward Pruitt before settling on Roland. "Mr. Strand, I need a few minutes. We ran your full panel overnight, and there's a number here I want to go over with you." She glanced at Pruitt, then back at Roland, choosing her next words with visible care. "Your blood sugar was critically low when you arrived. Dangerously low. For a man with no diabetic history on file, that's not something we typically see without." She stopped herself, recalibrating the sentence into something gentler. "I'd like to run it again before I say anything more definite. I just don't want you hearing a theory before we've confirmed a fact." Roland felt the room tilt slightly, though nothing in it had physically moved. "What kind of theory?" Dr. Anand didn't answer. A nurse appeared in the doorway behind her, urgent, a folder in her hand meant for the doctor's eyes only, and the 2 of them stepped half into the hallway, voices dropping too low to follow, leaving Roland alone with Pruitt and a sentence that had been cut off exactly where it mattered most. The monitor beside his bed, ticking on steadily, indifferent to everything that had just shifted in the room. The diner off Highway 96 smelled like burnt coffee and bleach, and Odessa had been elbow-deep in a sink full of dishes for 3 hours when the bell over the door rang and a man walked in who didn't belong there. Grease popped somewhere behind her on the flat top, and a waitress called out an order nobody answered fast enough. He wasn't dressed wrong exactly. Plain jacket, no tie. But he read the room before it noticed him doing it, a habit built over years, not manners. He didn't sit at the counter. He walked straight back toward the kitchen, and the manager who usually stopped strangers before they got that far, just stepped aside and let him through. "Odessa Freeman?" Her hands went still in the soapy water. Nobody said her full name like that anymore. Careful and deliberate, each syllable given weight. "Who's asking?" "Weldon Okafor. I work for Roland Strand." He kept his badge in his coat pocket instead of clipped to his chest, and she noticed that, filed it away. A man who could have led with authority and chose not to. "He's alive. He's asking for you." "They told me he was fine and I wasn't needed." The words came out flatter than she meant them to, worn smooth from repeating them to herself on the walk home 2 nights ago. "Who told you that?" A man in a gray suit. Said his name was Pruitt. Something crossed Weldon's face, brief, controlled, gone before it could be called an expression at all. Mr. Strand didn't say that. Mr. Strand's been asking where you were since the moment he woke up. Odessa dried her hands slowly, buying time to decide whether this was a con, or a mistake, or something worse. Why would a man like that care where I am? Because you're the reason he's alive to ask. Weldon said it plainly. No performance in it. The kind of sentence that only sounds simple, because the man saying it has decided simple, is more convincing than dramatic. And because of when it happened. What do you mean when? He glanced toward the front of the diner, toward the manager pretending not to listen, then lowered his voice. Mr. Strand had a shareholder vote scheduled for 6 that morning. A vote he'd spent 3 months trying to stop. If he'd died in that lot with nobody watching, the vote would have gone through automatically. Company bylaws. Incapacitation clause. He let that sit for a second before adding, "You being back there changed the timeline." That's not nothing to some people. Odessa felt something cold settle low in her stomach, a feeling she recognized from years of learning which strangers were dangerous before they'd done a single dangerous thing. You're saying somebody wanted him dead. I'm saying a man who runs a company that size doesn't collapse behind a gas station by accident, nearly as often as people assume. Weldon's tone didn't rise, didn't dramatize. And I'm saying whoever put him in that lot might be wondering right now how much you heard him say before the ambulance came. I'm not asking you to understand all of it tonight. I'm asking you to come see him. He's not going to stop asking until you do. She thought about the plastic chair by the vending machines, the security guard who hadn't needed to say anything to make her leave. Last time I trusted somebody from that hospital, they walked me out and never once asked if I was okay. I know, I heard. Weldon met her eyes, steady, the first person in 2 days who hadn't looked at her, and immediately started managing her. I'm not him. Odessa studied him a long moment, weighing a lifetime of reasons not to get in a stranger's car against the one reason that mattered more. The man in the gravel lot had gripped her wrist and refused to let go, and some part of her had never fully let go of that either. Let me get my coat. They were halfway to the parking lot when Weldon's phone buzzed against his hip. Once, then again fast enough to mean urgent instead of routine. He read it walking, his jaw tightening by degrees, and when Odessa tried to glance at the screen, he angled it away without seeming to think about it. Everything okay? Get in the car, he said, already moving faster than before, already scanning the lot behind them, no longer trusting a single shadow in it. We need to go, now. Odessa didn't ask again. She'd survived this long by learning exactly which moments to question, and which ones to simply obey, and something in his voice told her this one belonged in the second category. Roland Strand's private room smelled like antiseptic, trying to cover something sweeter underneath. Flowers someone had sent, and nobody had thrown out yet. Odessa stood in the doorway a moment before Weldon nudged her forward, and within seconds of entering she understood that everyone inside expected her to feel small. Roland didn't look at her the way Pruitt had, his eyes fixed on her, uncertain at first, then certain, proof standing in front of him that he hadn't imagined the voice in the gravel lot after all. It's you. His voice was rougher than it had been in the gravel lot, worn down by tubes and hours, but it carried the same weight it had carried when he'd gripped her wrist and refused to let go. Say it again. What you said to me, out there. Odessa hesitated, unsure why a grown man in a room full of machines needed her to repeat 4 words back to him, but something in his face told her this wasn't a small request, whatever it looked like from outside. Please don't leave me, sir. Roland's eyes closed. Something moved through his face that Odessa couldn't name. Not pain exactly, though it lived close to pain, closer to something long sealed shut finally breaking open. When he opened his eyes again they were wet, and he didn't try to hide it, which surprised her more than anything else about him so far. Nobody's asked me to stay for my own sake in longer than I can remember, he said, quiet, almost to himself. Everyone who talks to me wants something from what I have. You wanted me to keep breathing, that's all. I didn't know who you were, Odessa said. Wouldn't have mattered if I had. I believe that. He studied her for a long moment, the machines beeping steady between them. Sit down, please. She sat, carefully, in a chair that had probably never held anyone dressed the way she was. The vinyl creaked under her, too loud in a room this quiet. How long have you been on your own? Roland asked. long enough to know how to be. Odessa said it without self-pity, a fact stated plainly rather than a wound offered up for sympathy. I get by. Where do you sleep? She hesitated, weighing whether the truth would change how he looked at her, deciding it didn't matter either way. Behind the propane cage, where you were found. Something crossed his face, not pity, which she'd braced for, but recognition, a stranger's suffering having sat 40 feet from his own near death for longer than either of them knew. Where were you born? The question caught her off guard, too gentle for a man in a hospital bed with a security chief standing 2 feet behind him. Peach County, not far from here. Your mother. Roland's hand found the edge of the blanket, gripping it hard, an anchor to keep his voice steady. What happened to her? She died when I was 6, something that moved fast. I don't remember much, I was little. Odessa's voice flattened the way it always did around this part, worn smooth from years of repeating it. Been mostly on my own since. Roland said nothing for a moment that stretched too long to be comfortable. His grip on the blanket tightened until his knuckles paled, and something moved behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the machines or the pain medication. Something older, something that had been waiting 9 years for a door to crack open. If a story has ever made you sit forward without knowing why, subscribe now. What was her? Roland started, and stopped himself, the sentence catching in his throat, snagged on something deeper than he'd expected to find. He looked at Odessa, standing at the edge of a question he wasn't ready to finish asking. The door opened before he could try again. Weldon stepped back in fast, his phone still in hand, his expression rearranged into something Odessa hadn't seen on him yet, the calm gone, replaced by the look of a man who'd just read something he needed to act on immediately. Roland. Weldon's voice had lost its usual steadiness. We need to talk now. Roland's eyes stayed on Odessa, a beat longer than the moment allowed, forcing himself to set the question down before he could stand up and deal with whatever had just walked through the door. The extended stay motel off Route 41 had a flickering vacancy sign and a lock that stuck if you didn't lift the handle just right. But it was the first door Odessa had had to herself in longer than she could remember. Weldon had checked her in himself 2 nights after the hospital, paid in cash, and told her plainly that until he understood more about what had happened to Roland, he wanted her somewhere he could reach fast and somewhere nobody else could find easily. The room smelled like carpet cleaner and old smoke nobody had ever fully gotten out of the walls, but the door locked from the inside, and that alone made it feel safer than anywhere she'd slept in 2 years. You think somebody's looking for me, she'd said, not a question. I think somebody should be careful either way, he'd answered. She hadn't asked what he meant by that, and he hadn't offered more, and 2 days had passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Meals delivered instead of dumpster checked, a bed instead of a propane cage, silence loud enough to make her miss the noise of the highway. It was just past midnight when she heard the engine, not passing through, idling. Odessa went still on the bed, every year of sleeping somewhere she didn't own, snapping back into her spine at once. She crossed to the window without turning on a light, silent, careful, watching without being seen watching. A gap in the curtain gave her a narrow slice of parking lot, orange under the one working street lamp. A sedan sat 2 rows out, engine running, headlights off. Dark-colored, ordinary, the kind of car nobody looks at twice in a parking lot, which was exactly what made it wrong. She counted seconds, marking how long was too long to be nothing, the same count she'd run behind the propane cage 100 nights before. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. The car didn't pull into a space, it didn't back out, it just sat there, facing her door, patient in a way that felt deliberate rather than lost. Her mind went, unbidden, to the man in the pressed suit who'd stood over her at the hospital, asking whether security had checked what she'd been carrying. She didn't know if this car had anything to do with him. She only knew the stillness of it matched the stillness in his face. The stillness of a man who never rushes because he's already decided how a thing ends. Her first instinct wasn't to call the front desk. It had never once in her life been to call the front desk. Front desks belonged to people who trusted that someone official would help them, and Odessa had spent 17 years learning that trust was a door that only opened one direction. Instead, she backed away from the window, phone already in her hand, and dialed the number Weldon had given her, the one he'd said would reach him before it reached anyone else. He picked up on the second ring, alert immediately, no trace of sleep in his voice. "Odessa." "The car is back." 4 words. She didn't elaborate, didn't need to, because something in the flatness of her own voice told her he'd understand exactly what those words meant, faster than a longer explanation would. "Where?" "Parking lot. Facing my door. No plates I can see. Lights are off." A pause on his end, brief, the sound of him already moving, a door somewhere in the background clicking shut. "Stay away from the window. Don't turn on any lights. I'm 15 minutes out." "What if it's not 15 minutes? "Then you call me again, and I get there faster." His voice stayed level, steady, built to hold her steady along with it. "You did the right thing. Stay low." The line went quiet, but Odessa kept it pressed to her ear anyway, unwilling to lose the one sound proving she wasn't alone in this. She sat on the floor beneath the window instead of the bed, back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, counting her own breathing until the numbers blurred together. 10 minutes crawled by, longer than any 10 minutes had ever taken. Then, through the thin gap in the curtain, she saw the headlights blink on. Not fast, not the panic of someone caught. The car pulled forward slow, deliberate, unhurried, as if leaving had been the plan the whole time and not a reaction to anything. It rolled out of the lot, taillights shrinking down Route 41, the same direction the ambulance had gone 6 nights earlier. Odessa understood, sitting alone on a motel floor with her knees against her chest, that whoever had been watching her door hadn't been chased off by anything she'd done. They had simply decided, patiently, deliberately, that they'd seen enough for tonight, and would be back to see more. Roland was sitting up when Weldon brought Odessa back to the room, his color better than it had been, the tubes fewer than they were 2 days earlier, but something new sat behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. Weldon had told him about the car. Roland hadn't slept since, and it showed in the set of his jaw, the way his hand kept finding things to hold on to that didn't need holding. "Sit," he said, gentler than the word sounded. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me all of it this time. Not the short version." Odessa sat, the vinyl chair creaking under her again. "All of what?" "Your father." Roland's hand found the edge of the blanket the way it had before, gripping it tight, holding on. What happened to him? She'd told this story so few times that saying it out loud still felt fragile, dangerous, something that could cut her if she held it wrong. "He drove long-haul freight after my mama died, kept us going alone, worked doubles, taught me to read a map before I could ride a bike without training wheels. When I was 14, his rig went off an icy overpass outside Knoxville. Nobody else was involved, just ice, and a curve he didn't see coming." Roland closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something in his face had hardened into a kind of resolve Odessa hadn't seen from him yet. "And before your mother passed, did she ever talk about her own family? Where she came from?" "Not much. She died when I was 6, like I told you." Odessa's fingers found the inside pocket of her coat, without her deciding to move them there, an old habit worn into muscle memory. "I don't remember her voice anymore. Don't remember much at all. Just this." She drew out the photograph before she could talk herself out of it, water-stained, soft at every fold, kept for years inside a church program because the paper was thin enough to lie flat against her ribs without anyone patting her down and finding it. "May I?" She handed it over. His hand shook taking it, worse than it had shaken from any IV line. He turned it over first, before even looking at the picture, some instinct pulling him to the back of it, to a single line of handwriting gone soft and pale with years. The ink faded almost to nothing but still legible if a person knew to look. "Judith, before everything." Roland didn't say the name out loud. He didn't have to. Weldon, standing near the door, saw something move across his employer's face that 22 years of reading rooms had never once shown him. Not fear, not grief exactly. Something 9 years sealed shut, finally cracking down the middle. Subscribe before the next chapter breaks this story wide open. "Where did you get this?" Roland asked, so quiet the machines nearly swallowed it. "It was hers, my mother's. It's the only thing I kept when we moved after Daddy died." Odessa watched his face, unsure what she'd done wrong, only certain that something had. "Is that bad? Should I not have—" "No." Roland's voice cracked on the word. "No, you should always have kept it." He stared at the photograph a long moment, his thumb resting over the handwriting. afraid it might vanish if he stopped touching it. Then he looked up, past Odessa, straight at Weldon, his expression rearranged into something neither of them had seen from him since the night he woke up asking for a stranger's voice before his own name. "I need the custody records," he said. "The ones from 9 years ago. Judith's attorney filed them, and I refused to read them at the time." His hand tightened around the photograph, unwilling to let it go. "Pull every page. Tonight. I don't care whose sleep it interrupts." Weldon didn't ask why. He simply nodded, already reaching for his phone, already dialing before he'd fully left the room, understanding that whatever Roland had just seen in a water-stained photograph was bigger than anything a security detail alone could carry. Dr. Anand came back at dawn. No preamble this time, no easing into it. She set the tablet on the tray table and turned it toward Roland, her face carrying the particular stillness of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation in her head more than once before walking in. "We ran it twice," she said. "Same result both times. Your blood sugar was critically, dangerously low when you arrived. Consistent with a fast-acting insulin analog. Not something your body produced. Something introduced." The word landed in the room and stayed there, sharp, undeniable. "Someone did this to me," Roland said, not a question. "That's not my determination to make, but medically, yes. This wasn't a natural event." Weldon was already moving before she finished. Phone to his ear, voice low and fast. Roland stared at the ceiling tile he'd stared at the first night, the one with the water stain shaped like nothing in particular, and felt something in his chest go cold that had nothing to do with his heart. "The thermos," he said. "My thermos. From the truck." 4 people had access to it yesterday morning, Weldon said, hanging up. "Your driver, your assistant, Judith's ex-husband, who stopped by the depot before his flight out, and Foster, who refilled it himself before the shareholder vote." Nobody said the name out loud. Nobody had to. It sat in the room the same way Judith's name had sat there 2 days earlier, heavy, unavoidable. "Where's Foster now?" Roland asked. "Handling the board. Business as usual." Weldon's jaw tightened. "I've already made a call. There's a detective who's going to want your full medical file within the hour." Detective Renata Boone arrived faster than an hour, badge already out, coffee still steaming in her other hand, untouched, grabbed on her way out the door. She moved through the hospital hallway, unhurried, unshakable, notebook already open, questions already loaded. "Mr. Strand, I'm going to need the truck's route from yesterday morning. Every stop, every person who had eyes on that cab." Roland gave it to her in flat, clipped sentences, the same voice he used in boardrooms when a number surprised him, and he refused to let his face show it. Boone wrote without looking up, cross-referencing something on her own tablet as he spoke. She worked the suspect list fast, methodical. "Your driver was in Macon all morning. 3 witnesses confirm it. Your assistant flew to Chicago the night before, verified by the airline. Judith's ex-husband landed in Denver 2 hours before you collapsed. Flight logged, rental car logged, he's clear." She looked up from her notes. "That leaves 1 name on your list, Mr. Strand. Your girl," Boone said next, not glancing up again. "The one who found you. Odessa. What about her?" "She's been under surveillance. A vehicle outside her motel 2 nights ago. No plates." Boone finally looked up. "I pulled cell tower data near that motel for the same window. I want to check it against phone records for everyone with thermos access." The room went quiet except for the monitor. "You think whoever poisoned me is the same person watching her," Roland said. "I think it would be a remarkable coincidence if they weren't." Boone's voice stayed flat, professional. The voice of someone who'd learned coincidences were rarer than people wanted to believe. Attempted murder narrows to opportunity and motive. You said yourself there was a vote that morning. A vote worth a great deal of money to whoever benefited from you not surviving it. Weldon's phone buzzed. He read it, and his face didn't change, which was somehow worse than if it had. Foster's phone pinged a tower near that motel. Same night. Nobody spoke. Roland thought of every quiet boardroom maneuver he'd once mistaken for loyalty. Foster Pruitt had never needed to raise his voice to win a room, never needed to be first to speak, and lying in a hospital bed with a girl's photograph still warm in his coat pocket, Roland understood now that the same skill that made Foster valuable was the one that had almost killed him. Boone's own phone rang before anyone could say more. She answered fast, listened, her expression sharpening with every second that passed. She looked up at Roland and Weldon both, her notebook already closing. "Confirmed," she said. Pruitt's badge logged him at headquarters, 12 minutes before that vehicle idled outside the girls' motel, and logged him back in 9 minutes after it left. Same night. No gap large enough to explain. She was already reaching for her radio as she said it, already moving toward the door, her voice dropping into something flatter and faster than anything she'd used all morning. "We need to move now." Foster Pruitt was still adjusting his cufflinks when Detective Boone's team walked into the Strand Logistics boardroom in Atlanta. 12 members sat around the table. Mid-vote on the leadership restructuring, Pruitt had spent Roland's recovery quietly engineering. Paperwork already circulating for signatures. Coffee cooling untouched in front of half of them. Pruitt looked up first, and whatever calculation ran behind his eyes in that half-second failed to produce an exit. "Foster Pruitt, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Roland Strand." He didn't deny it right away. He straightened his jacket instead, a final performance of composure for a room that had trusted his calm for 22 years. "This is a misunderstanding that will embarrass all of us by lunch. Cell tower data puts you 2 miles from a witness's motel the same night that witness reported surveillance." Boone's voice stayed level. "Your access to the thermos, your motive tied to this morning's vote, and now obstruction of a witness. A grand jury won't need long." The vote collapsed before the paperwork finished circulating. Board members who'd spent 3 months maneuvering around Roland's opposition suddenly discovered they had none of their own to offer. By the time officers walked Pruitt out through the lobby, the company he'd nearly inherited by default had already stopped pretending the transition was inevitable. Roland heard about the arrest before he heard anything else that morning, Weldon's voice steady on the phone, relaying details Roland only half absorbed. He'd been discharged 2 days earlier, against his cardiologist's mild objections, and he took the call standing in the doorway between his kitchen and the sitting room beyond it, his attention drifting to the folder on the counter, the one Weldon had brought him an hour earlier, thick with 9-year-old custody filings he'd once refused to open. He'd read every page twice. Odessa arrived at noon, unaware of any of it, expecting another round of questions about her mother. Weldon met her at the front door first, his face doing something she hadn't seen from him yet. "He needs to tell you something," Weldon said. "Something big. He wanted to be the one." "Is he okay?" "He's better than he's been all week." Weldon led her through the front hall toward the kitchen, instead of answering further, and something in his restraint told her this wasn't his story to tell. Roland stood at the counter when she came in, steadier on his feet than she'd seen him, the folder closed in front of him, his hands resting on top of it, needing something solid to hold on to before he started. "Sit down, Odessa." She sat. 9 years ago, my daughter Judith left this company, left this state, and left me with a closed door I was too proud to knock on." His voice stayed level, but his hands weren't. "We stopped speaking. I told myself it was her choice. It was easier than admitting how much of it was mine. Easier than admitting I'd spent more hours protecting a company than I ever spent protecting her. I don't understand what this has to do with the photograph you carry, the handwriting on the back." Roland opened the folder and turned it toward her. Custody records, with a name typed at the top she'd never once heard her mother called out loud. "Your mother's name was Judith. Judith Strand, before she married your father." The kitchen went silent except for the refrigerator's low hum. "The truth just changed everything. Don't miss what's next. Subscribe." "That's not." Odessa's voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "My mother's name was Judith Freeman. That's what was on her. Freeman was your father's name. Before that, before everything, she was mine." Roland's eyes held hers, steady despite the tremor working through the rest of him. "You're my granddaughter, Odessa. I didn't know you existed until 3 days ago, in a hospital room, holding a photograph I never thought I'd see again." Odessa didn't move. She sat with the words settling over her, slow and total, rearranging everything underneath, without asking permission first. "You're saying I'm—" She stopped, started again. "You're saying I have family. This whole time, 40 miles from where I slept behind a gas station. I'm saying I failed to find you for reasons that were never yours to carry." Roland's voice cracked fully now, no effort left to hold it together. "And I'm saying I don't intend to fail again." Neither of them said anything more for a long moment. Odessa looked at the photograph resting on top of the folder. the same water-stained corners, the same faded ink, and understood that the sentence she'd spoken to a dying stranger behind a gas station had somehow, impossibly, been the truest thing she'd ever said to family she hadn't known she had. She didn't answer him in words. She didn't reach for the folder, didn't cry, didn't ask the dozen questions crowding behind her teeth. She simply stayed in the chair, didn't stand, didn't move toward the door, and let the silence stretch between them until it said more than either of them could have managed out loud. That whatever this was, whatever it meant for tomorrow or the next year or the rest of both their lives, she wasn't leaving this room. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't want to. 3 months later, Odessa sat at Roland's kitchen table with a cup of coffee she'd made herself, in a kitchen that had slowly stopped feeling like someone else's. Sunlight came through the window over the sink, catching dust in the air, steady and unhurried, and somewhere down the hall, a clock ticked calm, instead of urgent, for the first time either of them could remember. The custody paperwork was long finished, the guardianship long settled, and the table between them held nothing formal anymore. No folders, no photographs waiting to be explained, just 2 mugs and a plate of toast neither of them had finished. You could still ask for something, Roland said. The company, a settlement, anything. Nobody would think less of you for it. My lawyers have already drawn up 3 different versions, waiting on your word. I don't want the company. Odessa turned her mug slowly between her palms. I never did. Then what do you want? Really? He asked it the way he should have asked it the very first week, without an agenda behind it, just a grandfather waiting on an honest answer from the only family he had left. Odessa thought about it longer than the question probably needed. I want to know what my mama sounded like when she laughed. You said you remembered. I do. Loud. Too loud for rooms like this one. Something eased in his face. The tension of 9 unspoken years, finally finding somewhere to go. She got that from her own mother, not from me. I want somebody to notice if I don't come home one night. Odessa's voice stayed steady, plain, the same directness she'd carried since the gravel lot. I spent 2 winters being the only person keeping track of whether I was still alive. I don't want to do that anymore. Subscribe for more stories where kindness changes everything. You won't have to, Roland said. Not again, not while I'm breathing, and not after either. I've made sure of that in every way a lawyer can put on paper. That's not what I meant. I know. He reached across the table. Not for her hand exactly, just close enough that she could take it if she wanted to. I know what you meant, and I'm telling you anyway, because a man learns eventually that the paperwork isn't the point. Being here is. Odessa looked at him for a long moment, the same man who'd once believed loyalty could be bought outright, who'd built an empire on decisions that never needed a second opinion, sitting now in the same kitchen where he'd told her the truth 3 months earlier, waiting to see if a 17-year-old girl would let him stay in her life, the way she'd once let a stranger stay in his. Nothing about him looked like the man from the boardroom stories she'd since heard secondhand. No polish, no armor, just a grandfather in a wrinkled shirt waiting on an answer he had no power to force. She took his hand. You said it yourself, she said, in the gravel lot, before any of this. You said nobody asks you to stay for your own sake anymore. I remember. I'm asking now, not because you're dying, just because I want you here. Roland Strand, who had buried business partners without his pulse changing, and weathered 2 hostile takeovers without raising his voice, sat at his own kitchen table and let his eyes go wet in front of his granddaughter without once trying to hide it, the way he hadn't tried to hide it that first night in the hospital either, when a stranger's voice was the only thing that had made him want to keep breathing. Outside, the Georgia morning moved on, indifferent to what had just settled between 2 people who'd once been strangers behind a gas station and were now, plainly and permanently, family. Odessa finished her coffee, Roland finished his toast, and for the first time since either of them could remember, neither one of them was counting the minutes until something went wrong. Kindness doesn't ask what someone has or what they can offer back. A 17-year-old girl with nothing to her name once knelt in the gravel and asked a dying stranger to stay, not because of who he was, but because he was scared and she couldn't walk away. That single choice was the truest wealth in this story, long before anyone knew his name. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental.